The morning Gerald told me he wanted a divorce, I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a coffee mug that had a small chip on the rim. I'd been meaning to throw it out for 2 years. I remember thinking, as the hot water ran over my hands and his words settled into the air like ash from a fire, that I should have thrown it out the moment it chipped. That was the kind of woman I was. I held on to broken things long after they'd stopped being useful, and I called it loyalty. He didn't look at me when he said it. He was looking at his phone, scrolling, like a man checking the weather. 38 years. 38 years of grocery lists and doctor's appointments and sitting with him through his mother's death and his business failures and the 3 years when he drank too much and I quietly poured bottles down the drain and never once said a word about it. And he told me it was over while looking at his phone. "There's someone else," he said, and I noticed he used the present tense, not past. There is, not there was. It was already happening, whatever it was, had been happening for a while. I knew that the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds show up. Something in the pressure of the air, something in the particular quality of his silences over the past year and a half. Her name was Tiffany Mercer. She was 34. She did nails at a salon in the strip mall on Cavendish Road, and she was going to have his child in approximately 5 months. I set the coffee mug down on the counter very carefully. I dried my hands on the dish towel, and I did not cry. That's the thing people never quite believe when I tell the story. They expect me to say I screamed or fainted or threw something at him, but I didn't. Something happened inside me, not numbness exactly, more like the opposite. Like every nerve in my body suddenly fired all at once and then went quiet. And what was left behind was a kind of terrible clarity. I looked at Gerald Ashworth, at his silver hair, at his soft chin, at the wedding ring he was still wearing for some reason, even now, and I understood with the force of absolute certainty that this man had been a stranger to me for longer than I realized, and that I had simply not been paying attention. "Okay," I said. He looked up from his phone then. He'd been expecting something else. "Okay," he repeated. "I heard you," I said. "I'm going to need some time to think." I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 34 years, in the bedroom of the house we'd bought together in the spring of 1996, and I listened to the sound of my own breathing. Fitzgerald, one of the 2 cats I was temporarily fostering from the Millhaven County Animal Shelter, a large orange tabby with the disposition of a retired philosophy professor, jumped up onto the bed and sat beside me, blinking slowly. He smelled like warm dust and something faintly herbal. I put my hand on his back and felt him purr. "Well," I said to Fitzgerald, very quietly, "let's think." My name is Nora Ashworth. I was 63 years old when my life fell apart, and 63 when I put it back together, and the distance between those 2 events was approximately 11 months, though some days it felt like a century, and some days it felt like a single long exhale. I had been a school librarian for 30 years, 22 at Millhaven Elementary, 8 at the district's middle school before I retired at 60. I loved that job with a specificity that surprised people. Not just the books, though of course the books, but the architecture of information itself, the way things were cataloged and cross-referenced, the way a good index led you somewhere you hadn't expected to go. I knew public records the way a carpenter knows wood grain. I knew how county land offices worked, how property titles were structured, how to navigate archives that most people didn't even know existed. Librarians know how to find things. It is, at its core, what we do. After I retired, I'd been volunteering 2 afternoons a week at the Millhaven County Animal Shelter, walking dogs, doing intake paperwork, occasionally taking animals home for short-term foster care. That's how I'd come to have Fitzgerald and his companion, Mencken, a small, imperious black cat, named after H.L. Mencken because he seemed to disapprove of everything. Living in my guest bathroom with a litter box and a fleece blanket and strong opinions about being left alone. I'd taken them in 6 days before Gerald dropped his particular bomb, and in the weeks that followed, I would find myself absurdly grateful for their company, for the simple animal fact of another heartbeat in the room. Gerald and I had 2 children. Derek was 22, newly graduated from state, working part-time at his father's financial consulting firm, a job Gerald had arranged, a job Derek was mildly competent at and wildly comfortable in. Cassidy was 19, in her second year at Millhaven Community College, still living at home, still expecting her laundry done and her dinners made, with the serene assumption of someone who has never been required to question whether those things happen automatically. I loved my children. I want to be clear about that, because what comes next might make it sound otherwise. I loved them the way you love something you made with your own body and your own sleepless years, imperfectly, fiercely, with a complicated tangle of pride and worry and hope that never quite untangles, no matter how old they get. I loved them, and I did not know them, apparently. That was the thing I had to learn. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the life before, because it matters. You can't understand what broke without understanding what was whole. The house on Sycamore Terrace was a colonial with green shutters and an overgrown hydrangea bush by the front door that I'd been threatening to prune for 15 years and never did. Gerald had grown up in apartments and wanted land, so we'd bought a half-acre lot in 1996 with a down payment that I have very specific, very documented reasons to remember clearly. The kitchen smelled like whatever I'd been cooking, and old wood and the particular note of humidity that old houses in the Northeast develop after enough decades. The floors creaked in a pattern I knew by heart. 2 steps past the landing, 1 step before the bathroom door. And I had navigated that pattern in the dark for so long that my feet found the quiet places automatically, the way old musicians find the right notes without thinking. I made coffee every morning at 6:15. Gerald preferred his in silence, reading the financial section on his tablet. I preferred mine with the window open, even in November, even when the cold came in and the steam rose from the cup in a small personal cloud. We had not had a real conversation at breakfast in, I would estimate, 7 years. I thought of this as a comfortable companionship, the kind that long marriages develop. I understand now that it was something else. The neighbors on our street were people I'd known for decades. Barbara and Ed Fortunato to the left, who'd retired to Florida 6 years ago, but still owned the house and rented it to a rotating cast of young families. The Kimuras on the right, Yuki was a nurse, her husband Jin taught high school chemistry. Their daughter was in 3rd grade and had once asked me very seriously whether cats could read. I told her that Fitzgerald probably could, but preferred not to. She'd accepted this as a reasonable answer. And directly across the street, in the yellow house with the window boxes that were always, in every season, spectacularly well-maintained, Beverly Kowalski. Bev and I had been friends for 21 years. Since the summer, she'd moved in with her then-husband, who had since departed the scene in a blaze of mediocrity and bad financial decisions. And she had since reconstructed her life with a thoroughness and a cheerfulness that I found, in those early dark days of my own unraveling, genuinely instructive. She was 64, a retired RN with the compact energy of someone who'd spent 30 years managing emergencies and had developed a deep philosophical calm about everything except stupidity, which she found unforgivable and said so, loudly and with significant profanity. Ruth Papadopoulos was our third, the anchor of what we privately called the Tuesday group, though it had started as a Tuesday group and migrated over the years to whatever day suited us best, which was usually Thursday. Ruth was 67, Greek-American by marriage, if not by blood. Her late husband Stavros had died 4 years ago and left her a small flower shop on Mill Street that Ruth ran with the serene competence of someone who had realized, in her 60s, that she was very good at exactly one thing, and that one thing was enough. She lived 12 minutes away by car, and she arrived everywhere exactly on time, which Bev found mildly suspicious. The three of us had been going to a ceramic painting studio on Elm Street, Earthen Artistry, run by a patient young woman named Callie, who had made peace with the fact that her Thursday evening slot was permanently occupied by 3 older women who spent 40% of their time actually painting ceramics and 60% talking about everything else. We painted mugs and serving plates and small decorative bowls, and occasionally something ambitious that collapsed in the kiln. Bev had once attempted a full soup tureen. We don't talk about the soup tureen. That Thursday, 3 days after Gerald's announcement, I walked into Earthen Artistry with Mencken in a canvas bag over my shoulder. I was still doing twice daily Foster check-ins that week and couldn't leave him alone. And Callie had, after a brief and very reasonable negotiation, agreed that a cat in a bag was technically not covered by the no pets policy. And I sat down across from Bev and Ruth and said, very quietly, Gerald wants a divorce. He got someone pregnant. Bev set down her paintbrush. Are you fucking kidding me? She said. Not a question. Ruth, who expressed strong feeling through precise silence, said nothing for exactly 4 seconds and then said, tell me everything. I told them everything, or as much as I knew, which was not yet, I would discover, nearly as much as I thought. Mencken sat in the canvas bag with his head out and his eyes half closed, conveying the general impression that he had heard worse and found human drama tedious. Bev painted an increasingly aggressive abstract pattern on her mug. Ruth listened with her hands flat on the table, perfectly still. Okay, Bev said when I'd finished. First question, the house. Is your name on it? Both our names. Always has been. Good. Second question, lawyer. Do you have one? Not yet. Bev pointed her paintbrush at me. It left a small blue mark in the air. Monday. You call a lawyer Monday. I don't care if it's Saturday. You call Monday. I know, I said. I mean it, Nora. I have seen what happens when women wait to get a lawyer, and it is not a story with a good ending. Bev had, in fact, waited 6 months to get a lawyer during her own divorce, and she had opinions about this that she expressed whenever the subject arose, which was somewhat regularly. I know, I said again. I'm going to. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She had small, dry hands that smelled like whatever flowers she'd been arranging that day. That Thursday, it was something with eucalyptus. You're not crying, she said. No, I said. Good, she said simply. She picked up her own brush and continued painting a very precise geometric border on a salad plate. Crying is for later. Right now, we think. Fitzgerald, who I'd left at home in the guest room, was at that moment, I would learn, systematically removing Gerald's reading glasses from the nightstand and relocating them to under the bed. This was not a deliberate act of solidarity. It was simply Fitzgerald being Fitzgerald, but I would take it. The first real conversation I had with my children after Gerald's announcement did not go the way I expected. I'd expected shock, of course, some version of disbelief, some outrage on my behalf, some rallying of the kind that children do around a wronged parent. I'd expected, I realize now, a fundamental loyalty that I had simply assumed existed and had never thought to test. Derek came home from his father's office that Friday evening, and I asked him to sit down in the kitchen, and I told him. I watched his face as I spoke. He nodded, twice, with a specific kind of careful neutrality that I recognized, with a cold lurch in my stomach, as the expression of someone who is not surprised. "I know," he said when I'd finished. The kitchen went very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Mencken, who had been sitting on the windowsill behind Derek's head, opened one eye. "You know," I repeated. "Dad told me last month," Derek said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Not ashamed, uncomfortable. The way you are when you've been put in a social situation that inconveniences you. "He said he was going to tell you. I didn't think it was my place to—" "He told you last month?" I said. "Mom." "He told you last month," I said again, "and you sat at this table every night and ate the food I cooked and watched me and said nothing." Derek looked at his hands. He was a handsome young man who looked too much like his father. The same jaw, the same way of going quiet when he was cornered, the same fundamental belief that problems, if not acknowledged, would eventually sort themselves out. "I didn't want to get in the middle of it. I'm your mother. I know that. I'm your mother," I said, "and your father had an affair for how long? Do you know?" A pause, a fractional, damning pause. "About 2 years, Derek said. 2 years. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, someone's sprinkler came on with a sound like a small, ridiculous argument. 2 years. I had been standing in this kitchen for 2 years, making coffee and dinner and grocery lists, while my husband and my son both knew, and neither of them had said a word. "Okay," I said. "Thank you for telling me." Derek looked at me with the wariness of someone who has been expecting an explosion and is not sure what to make of the calm. "Mom, I'd like some time alone," I said. He left the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs. I sat very still and I thought about the particular quality of the past 2 years, about the dinners where Gerald had been distracted, about the weekends when he'd said he had client meetings, about the way Derek had started going to dinner with friends on Friday nights, with what I'd registered only vaguely as a new regularity. I assembled the picture in my mind the way you assemble an archive, piece by piece, building the structure from the available material, and when I had it complete, I sat with it for a long time. Then I went upstairs and retrieved Mencken from the windowsill and held him against my chest and breathed very deliberately until my heart rate came down. He submitted to this with a dignified tolerance that I appreciated. Cassidy was easier to read because Cassidy had never been good at hiding things she found complicated. She was home that evening watching something on her laptop in her room, and when I knocked and told her we needed to talk, she went through her expressions in a sequence I could map like a weather system. Surprise, then calculation, then the specific arrangement of features that meant she was deciding how much to admit. She had known for 8 months. Gerald had told her before Christmas, asking her to keep it quiet while things sorted themselves out. She had agreed. She had kept my company at Christmas dinner, at New Year's, at Easter, at my birthday in March. She had sat across from me at this table and watched me be cheerful and had said nothing, because her father had asked her not to, and because she had, apparently, found that an acceptable arrangement. "He said it would upset you," she said. She was 19 and she was not stupid, and she knew, even as she said it, that it was inadequate. I could see her knowing it. "He said you'd take it hard and it wasn't the right time." "And you thought that was reasonable," I said. She opened her mouth and closed it. "I didn't know what to think. It wasn't my situation." "I'm your mother," I said, for the second time that day. "I know," she said very quietly. 8 months, I said. "Cassidy, 8 months." She started to cry, which I had no patience for at that moment, which made me feel briefly like a bad person. And then I thought about sitting across from her at Easter and talking about her spring semester coursework while she sat there and looked me in the face and knew, and the feeling passed. "I'm going to need some space this evening," I said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. Fitzgerald came and sat beside me, warm and solid and smelling of dust and that indefinable herbal thing, and I thought, well, now I know exactly where I stand. The following week was a kind of triage: emotional, logistical, strategic. I called a lawyer on Monday, as Bev had instructed. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she had short silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and an office that smelled like old coffee and competence. And within the first 15 minutes of our consultation, she had asked 4 questions that made me understand I needed to think about this very differently than I'd been thinking about it. "Is your name on the deed?" she asked. "Yes, both names." "When was the house purchased?" "April 1996. "How was the down payment funded?" And here is where the part of me that had spent 30 years in archives sat up and paid attention. Because Gerald had said, when he'd mentioned divorce to me that first evening, something I'd almost let slide past. My parents' gift covered most of the down payment, so the equity picture isn't as simple as you might think. I had let it slide past in the moment because I'd been in shock, but by Monday morning it had surfaced, and I'd been turning it over since then with the particular attention of someone who knows that details matter, that documents matter, that the paper trail of a life doesn't lie even when the people in it do. "The down payment," I said slowly, "was partly from Gerald's parents, but also I sold my car that spring, a 1989 Volvo I'd had since graduate school. I sold it privately for $4,200, and I have reason to believe that money went into the down payment." Patricia Vance looked at me over her reading glasses. "Do you have documentation of that sale?" "I don't know yet," I said, "but I know where to look." She nodded once approvingly. "Let's talk about what else you might need." I left her office with a yellow legal pad full of notes and a sensation in my chest that I would eventually identify as the very early precursor to anger, the cold, clarifying kind, not the hot, useless kind. Something was sharpening inside me. Something was coming into focus. On the way home, I stopped at Earthen Artistry. Callie was there, setting up for an evening class, and she let me sit at the back table with a cup of coffee while I thought. I wasn't painting anything. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't the house. I called Bev from the parking lot afterward. "How'd it go?" she said. "I need to find a document from 1996, I said. "A bill of sale for a car." "And do you think you can find it?" "I think it's in a filing box in the basement," I said. "Gerald never throws anything out." A pause. "Nora," Bev said, with a kind of quiet ferocity that I loved her for, "go find that document." Gerald, in the meantime, was making plans. He had, apparently, not expected the process to be complicated. He had imagined, I think, and this tells you something about the inside of Gerald Ashworth's head, that I would be sufficiently destabilized by the announcement to simply agree to whatever division he proposed, take whatever was offered, and quietly exit the field so that his new life could begin. He had been imagining this, I suspect, for some time. The divorce papers his lawyer filed 3 weeks after his announcement proposed a split that gave him 60% of the home equity, based on the claim that his parents' contribution had constituted the majority of the original purchase price, and that my contribution to the household over the past 3 years of my retirement had been, I am quoting the document here, largely domestic in nature. Largely domestic in nature. I read that phrase in Patricia Vance's office, sitting in the same chair as before, and something crystallized. 30 years of work before retirement. 3 years of managing the house after, of cooking and organizing and maintaining the property, of doing the invisible scaffolding of a life that Gerald Ashworth had simply stood inside of and called his own. Largely domestic in nature. He's going to argue, Patricia said carefully, that the home equity should reflect the original capital contributions. His attorney is going to push hard on the parental gift angle. How much was the gift, I asked. According to the filings, $40,000. And the purchase price? $120,000 in 1996. I did the math in my head. 40,000 out of 120 is a third, not a majority. Correct. And I put in 4,200, I said, which I now have documentation for. Patricia raised an eyebrow. I had, in fact, found the document. It had taken me 4 hours in the basement with a flashlight and a step stool and the methodical patience of someone who had spent 3 decades locating misfiled records. But I had found it. A handwritten bill of sale dated March 14, 1996, for a 1989 Volvo 240DL sold by Nora Ellen Ashworth to one Marcus Freed for $4,200 cash. Below it, in a different hand, was a deposit receipt from First Millhaven Savings Bank dated March 17, 1996. $4,200 deposited to the joint account that had been used 6 weeks later to fund the down payment. I had spent 30 years knowing how paper trails work. Gerald had spent 30 years assuming I wasn't paying attention. That's documented? Patricia said. That's documented, I said. She looked at the papers I'd brought. She looked at me. She allowed herself a very small smile. Good. This changes the picture considerably. It was a Tuesday, though technically our Thursday group had moved to Tuesday that particular week because Ruth had a supplier delivery on Thursday, when Derek said the thing that I will probably carry with me in some form for the rest of my life. I'd been downstairs making tea when he came into the kitchen, back from his father's office, jacket still on, keys in hand, looking like a man who'd been preparing a speech and wasn't sure it was the right one. Mom, he said, I want you to know that I'm going to stay in my apartment. Well, here, for now. But I think it might be better if Dad suggested. What did your father suggest? I said. I kept my voice very even. I was getting good at that. Derek set his keys on the counter. He thinks, and I kind of agree, that this is his house, in the sense that he built the financial foundation for it, and it might be cleaner for everyone if you considered finding somewhere to transition to while things get sorted. I looked at my son. He was 22 years old, and he was wearing a tie, which Gerald had started requiring of employees at the firm, And he looked at that moment exactly like a smaller version of his father. Same careful reasonableness, same fundamental confidence that the world would arrange itself around his convenience. "Derek," I said, very slowly and very clearly, "this is my house as much as it is your father's, and I will not be moving out of it voluntarily. If he wants me out, he'll need to persuade a court. And I think he'll find that more difficult than he currently imagines." Derek opened his mouth. "And furthermore," I said, still at that same careful, even volume, "I'd like you to think very carefully about where your loyalties are in this situation and what it means to declare them, because you are not being neutral. You are making choices, and those choices have weight, and I remember them." He looked like I'd slapped him. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't needed to. I poured my tea and went back upstairs. From the guest room, Mencken watched me come in with the expression of a judge who has heard the case and reserved his opinion. "I know," I said to him. I sat down. I breathed. "I know." Cassidy came to me that same week, 2 days later, with an expression that walked the line between conciliatory and strategic. She sat across from me in the living room and told me she thought I was handling the situation really well and that she was sure things would work out. And then she said, circling around it with the delicacy of someone who had rehearsed, "I'm thinking I might stay in my room here while the process is going on. You know, keep things stable." "Of course," I said. She visibly relaxed. "I'll need you to start contributing to groceries," I said. The relaxation reversed. "I'm a student." "You have a part-time job," I said. $200 a month. That's reasonable for what I provide." "Dad never—" "I am not your father," I said. And something in the way I said it made her go quiet. "And the arrangement going forward is going to be different from the arrangement you're used to. That's not a punishment. That's reality." She was not happy. She left the room with the door not quite slammed, but deliberately closed with more force than necessary. I sat with the sound of it and felt, underneath the tiredness, a small, strange satisfaction. Not cruelty. I want to be very clear about this. Just the sensation of someone who has, after a very long time, stopped arranging herself around the comfort of others. Bev came over that Thursday evening with a bottle of very decent red wine and the specific intention of being useful. We sat at the kitchen table. Fitzgerald was on the counter, technically not allowed on the counter, but we had reached a détente on that point. Mencken was on top of the refrigerator, surveying the room with a proprietary air that I found reassuring. "Okay," Bev said, pouring. "Where are we?" I told her about the document, about Patricia Vance, about Derek's speech and Cassidy's visit. Bev listened. She had a way of listening that was absolute. No interruption, no premature comfort, just attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Derek knew for 2 years," she said. "A little over a year and a half," I said. "Approximately."
"Jesus Christ," said Bev. She took a drink. "That boy has been eating your food for a year and a half, knowing his father was—" "Yes." "Nora?" "Yes," I said again. "I'm going to say something, and I need you to hear it without arguing," Bev said. "Okay." "You have been taking care of everyone in this house for a very long time, and not one of them, not one, has taken care of you. And now they want you to also take care of the situation for them. They want you to be reasonable and to not make it difficult and to fade out gracefully, because that is what you've always done and they expect you to keep doing it." I was quiet. "Are you going to do that?" Bev said. No, I said. Bev smiled. It was not a gentle smile. It was the smile of a retired nurse who has seen things and survived them and retained her capacity for dark satisfaction. Good. What do you need? I need you to help me go through 2 more boxes from the basement this weekend, I said. There might be additional documentation in there. Done. Saturday morning. I'll bring coffee. And I need to talk to Ruth about using her shop's printer. Mine is out of toner, and I don't want to print at the library where someone might see. I'll call her tonight. And, I said, I need you to stop me if I start being reasonable about this. Bev looked at me across the wine glass. Honey, she said, I haven't let anyone in my life be unreasonably reasonable since 2011. You are in excellent hands. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about the lawyer strategy and the document timeline and the precise legal argument around homemaker contribution to marital equity, which Patricia had outlined for me and which I had begun to understand in its implications. We talked about Gerald's likely next moves. He was a financial consultant. He thought in terms of leverage. He would look for pressure points. And we talked about what pressure points I had and he didn't know about.
And in the middle of all of this, Mencken descended from the refrigerator, walked the length of the counter with the stately pace of someone on a constitutional, and knocked Gerald's spare reading glasses off the counter with one precise paw. They clattered to the floor. Mencken continued walking without looking back. Bev stared at him. I like that cat, she said. He has strong opinions, I said. Don't we all, said Bev, and refilled her glass. 3 weeks after the initial filing, Gerald's attorney made a formal settlement offer. It was, in the technical sense of the word, an offer. In every other sense, it was a humiliation dressed in legal language. A figure that represented what Gerald thought I would accept, because I always accepted what was offered. Because I had spent 38 years in a pattern of acceptance that he had mistaken for the permanent shape of my character. I read it in Patricia Vance's office. I read it twice. I put it down on the desk. No, I said. Patricia nodded. I'd recommend we counter with the full documentation package. Yes, I said. Let's do that. The documentation package was, by that point, comprehensive. The 1996 bill of sale and deposit receipt. A spreadsheet I had spent 2 evenings building, itemizing the direct financial contributions I had made to the household over 38 years, not even including the economic value of unpaid domestic labor, which Patricia had flagged as a separate line of argument. The property tax records showing joint ownership. The joint bank account statements from the first decade of our marriage, when we had pooled salaries, before Gerald had gradually restructured the finances in ways that made him the primary account holder and me, effectively, a dependent. A restructuring that I had let happen because I'd trusted him, because I hadn't been paying attention, because I'd been busy with the children and the job and the house and all the things that were, in Gerald's framing, largely domestic in nature. I had paid attention now. I had spent 3 weeks paying the most focused attention of my life. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with my tea, and I thought about the 1996 spring. I thought about selling the Volvo. She'd been a good car, very reliable, faintly blue, with a heater that made a particular clicking sound on cold mornings. I'd been sad to sell her. I'd needed the money for the down payment on the future. I'd thought the future would be a certain kind of thing, and it had turned out to be a completely different one. And here we were. Fitzgerald jumped up on the table, which he was also not supposed to do. He walked across to me and sat down directly in front of my face, which is a thing cats do to assert that you should be paying attention to them instead of your own thoughts. He had very large amber eyes and an expression of patient interest. "We're going to be all right," I said to him. I was not sure if I was telling him or myself, but it didn't seem to matter much. He blinked. "I should tell you about the ramen." Approximately 5 weeks in, Gerald decided that the appropriate next step was to bring Tiffany Mercer to the house. I don't know what he was thinking. I've tried to reconstruct the logic, and I genuinely cannot. Perhaps he thought it would accelerate things, make the situation concrete, make me more eager to vacate. Perhaps he simply lacked the imagination to understand how it would feel. Or perhaps, and I think this is most likely, he had simply never, in 38 years, had to seriously consider how things felt to me. And he didn't start now. He brought her on a Wednesday evening. I was in the kitchen making a pot of ramen soup, the real kind, from scratch, the long simmering kind that Bev had taught me years ago and that I made when I needed the comfort of a process. The broth had been going since noon. The house smelled of ginger and pork bone and something that was very specifically the smell of being carefully taken care of. Gerald came in through the front door. I heard voices. Tiffany Mercer was smaller than I'd expected. She was pretty in the way that many young women are pretty. Smooth skin, highlighted hair, a roundness at her midsection that was now quite visible at 5 months. She was wearing a maternity top and an expression that I could only describe as resolute discomfort. She clearly didn't want to be here any more than I wanted her here. That, I thought, was the one thing we had in common. Gerald stood in the kitchen doorway with the air of a man who has miscalculated but intends to see it through. "I thought we should all meet," he said. I turned from the stove. I looked at Tiffany Mercer. She looked back at me with wide brown eyes that contained, under the discomfort, something that looked very much like apology. I don't think she'd expected me to be whatever it was she saw, not who she'd expected. "Hello," I said pleasantly. "I'm Nora." "I know," she said. "I'm Tiffany. I know." I turned back to the stove. "Gerald, if you'd like to talk, I'm available after dinner. I'm in the middle of something that requires attention right now." Gerald opened his mouth. "The broth needs to be watched at this stage," I said, without turning around. 38 years of marriage should have told you that I don't leave a broth unattended." A silence. "Nora," Gerald said, in the tone of a man attempting reasonableness. "After dinner," I said. I stirred the broth. The kitchen smelled extraordinary. "You're welcome to sit in the living room." I heard them retreat. I stirred the broth. From the counter, Fitzgerald watched the doorway for a long moment, then turned and sat with his back to it, which is a statement in cat terms. The conversation after dinner was brief. Gerald said he wanted to know if I'd reconsider the settlement. I said I had, in fact, reconsidered it, and my reconsideration was that it was insufficient. He said the process was taking longer than expected. I said yes, it was, and that was because the question of equity was more complicated than he'd apparently assumed. He said, and this is the moment I think about most when I think about that evening, the sentence that perhaps most precisely summarized what had gone wrong. "I just don't understand why you're making this so difficult." I looked at him across the kitchen table. I thought about 38 years. I thought about the deposit receipt from March 17th, 1996. I thought about the 2 children upstairs who had known and said nothing, eating my food and accepting my care for months while keeping his secret. I thought about Tiffany Mercer's apologetic eyes and about the life growing in her body that was, in some technical sense, my problem to resolve. "I'm not making anything difficult," I said. "I'm simply requiring that things be fair. Those 2 concepts can look the same from certain angles." He left. Tiffany left. I sat at the kitchen table with the cold remains of my ramen soup, which was, even cold, very good. Mencken came and sat on the table. Again, against the rules. Again, I had let the rules slide. And we sat together in the late quiet of the house, and the refrigerator hummed, and a neighbor's dog barked once, twice, and went silent. I was not happy. But I was, somewhere underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the slow-burning anger, fully awake. Maybe for the first time in years. Ruth called me on a Sunday morning in mid-September, 3 months in. She called at 8 o'clock, which meant it was important. Ruth did not call before 10 on Sundays as a matter of personal principle. I heard something, she said, without preamble. Tell me, I said. My supplier, Marco, his wife is in that nail salon on Cavendish. She knows Tiffany. A pause, the precise length of a woman who understands the weight of what she's about to say. She says Gerald has been telling people around town that the divorce is your fault, that you've been emotionally distant for years, that the situation with Tiffany developed because he was lonely. I sat very still. He's been saying this to who? People at the Chamber of Commerce, apparently. Clients. Some people from your church. The church we'd attended together for 20 years. The people I'd sat next to in pews, baked casseroles for in sickness, greeted at Christmas services with the authentic warmth of someone who genuinely liked them. He's managing the narrative, I said, very quietly. Yes, Ruth said. I thought you should know. Thank you, I said. Ruth, thank you. I hung up the phone. I sat with my coffee. Outside, a cardinal was doing something emphatic in the hydrangea bush. The hydrangea I'd been meaning to prune for 15 years. The unpruned hydrangea, unruly and overgrown and spectacular in full bloom, which I had apparently never had the right moment to cut back. I thought, let him talk. Let him tell whatever version he needs to tell. I have documents. But under that thought, quieter and more difficult was the other one. He knew what he was doing. He had been thinking about this for longer than I knew. He had prepared the ground before I even knew there was ground to prepare. This, I thought, was what 2 years of keeping a secret looked like from the other side. He'd been planning. He'd been arranging. I'd been making broth. I called Bev. She answered on the second ring with, I saw Ruth called you. What did she say? Gerald's been working the social circuit, I said. Emotional distance, lonely husband, the whole package. Son of a bitch, Bev said, with the flat efficiency of genuine contempt. Okay, what do you want to do? I want to do nothing reactive, I said. I want to stay on course. Good. But I'd like to talk it through. Come over, she said. I'll make eggs. I got in the car and drove the 30 seconds across the street and ate eggs at Bev's kitchen table, and we talked for 2 hours about what Gerald was doing and why it wouldn't ultimately work the way he thought it would, and about the particular arrogance of a certain kind of man who has been powerful for so long that he assumes he can control the temperature of every room. And we talked about what I was going to do instead, which was quieter and more thorough and considerably more effective. At one point, Bev said, you know, if we really wanted to make his life interesting, we could. And she outlined a plan that involved the county assessor's office and a very targeted FOIA request that I genuinely could not have explained my way out of if asked. And we laughed until we cried, bent over the kitchen table. And then we agreed that we would do absolutely none of it because it was unnecessary and probably inadvisable. But it would be funny, Bev said, wiping her eyes. It would be spectacular, I agreed. We did not do it. We didn't need to. The hearing was scheduled for 43 days after the initial filing. I spent those days with Patricia Vance building the case. I spent them in the county land records office, which was a building I had walked past 1,000 times in 30 years and never entered. Staffed by a very helpful woman named Carol, who had strong opinions about the superior organizational system of the pre-digital filing era, and who found me, I think, a kindred spirit. I spent them at my kitchen table in the evenings, going through our joint financial history with the methodical patience of someone who has nothing to hide and everything to clarify. I found things, not dramatic things, not hidden accounts or secret assets, the kind of thing that happens in movies. Smaller things, consistent things. A pattern of restructuring over 20 years that had gradually, incrementally moved the financial center of gravity in Gerald's direction, using my trust as the fulcrum. He'd done it slowly, the way you shift weight in a marriage without meaning to. Or maybe meaning to, maybe not even aware you're doing it, which is almost worse. Each individual step had been reasonable. The cumulative effect was that I had become, on paper, significantly less than an equal partner in a life I'd been building in equal measure. I documented all of it. Carol in the Land Records Office helped me pull 3 different filings. My own 30-year-old professional instincts helped me read them in context. Patricia Vance told me at our 4th meeting that I had built a stronger position than she'd expected. Stronger how? I asked. She looked at me over her reading glasses. Strong enough that I think we can push for a different resolution, she said. Not just equity split. Some additional consideration for the structural disadvantage you'd been placed in over the course of the marriage. I thought about that phrase, structural disadvantage. Such a clean, neutral way to describe the experience of trusting someone completely and having them use that trust as a tool. Yes, I said, let's pursue that. Derek and Cassidy, in the meantime, had made decisions. Derek announced in the 3rd week of October that he was going to move in with Gerald, that his father had offered him better accommodation and that it made practical sense. He said this at the kitchen table with the slightly defiant look of someone who knows what he's doing and has decided to do it anyway. That's your choice, I said. Mom, Derek, that's your choice. You're a grown man. Make it. He moved out on a Saturday. I helped him carry boxes to his car because I am his mother and I will be his mother when he's 60. And the fact that he has made choices I find difficult does not change that. It just changes what being his mother means from here forward. He hugged me at the end of it, stiffly, and I hugged him back, and I could feel him waiting for me to say something that would make it easier. I didn't say anything. I let him have the discomfort. I thought he'd earned it. Cassidy stayed. She paid her $200 a month. She was quieter than she'd been, which I found, honestly, an improvement. She started doing her own laundry without being asked, somewhere around week 6. I noticed this and said nothing, which was, I think, the right response. Some evenings, she would come downstairs and find me reading in the living room with Fitzgerald on the couch beside me. He had, by this point, permanently exited the guest room and claimed the entire house as his territory, which Mencken tolerated with the weary diplomacy of someone who has chosen his battles. And she would sit in the armchair across from me, and we would sometimes talk and sometimes not. Those silences were different from the silences Gerald and I had had at breakfast. They were uncomfortable, but they were working silences. The kind where something is being renegotiated in the space between 2 people who are trying to figure out who they are to each other. I didn't push. I thought, we have time. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. This is not surprising. What surprised me was what the sleeplessness felt like. Not dread exactly, and not anxiety in the conventional sense, more like a kind of heightened alertness. The feeling of being very present in my own body and my own house, aware of the creaking floors and the hum of the refrigerator, and the October wind in the hydrangea outside. Aware of each specific thing around me with the attention you pay to things when you understand they might change. I got up at 2 in the morning and went downstairs. I made tea, chamomile, which I normally find too sweet, but which was appropriate for 2 in the morning. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea and the dark outside the window and the small, warm light of the under cabinet lamp, and I thought about 38 years. I thought about Gerald the way he'd been at 30, ambitious and funny and genuinely kind in ways that I think he'd stopped being so gradually he hadn't noticed. I thought about the early years of the marriage, the small apartment on Whitfield Avenue, the way we'd stayed up late talking about everything, the way he'd read to me once when I had the flu, 2 chapters of a novel I can't remember the title of, just reading aloud in the dim bedroom while I was too sick to do anything but listen. That was real. It was real, and it was 30 years ago, and it had not been enough in the end to hold against everything else. I thought about my children as babies, Derek's particular smell when he was small, something milky and faintly talcum. Cassidy's habit of grabbing a fistful of my hair in her sleep. The specific weight of them in my arms at different ages, the graduated weight of growing children. I thought about the document I'd found in the basement, the bill of sale, the deposit slip, the 3-day gap between them, the chain of evidence I'd built from a life I'd lived without knowing I was building a case. I thought, I am not the woman who sat at this table 3 months ago. Something happened in the space of these 3 months that I did not entirely choose and cannot entirely explain. Some rearrangement of what I take up and what I let go. Some fundamental reprioritization of my own weight in the world. Fitzgerald came downstairs and sat in the kitchen doorway and looked at me. "I'm okay," I said. He walked to my feet and sat down on them, which is a specific thing he did that I had come to understand as a form of commitment. Not affection exactly, not the demonstrative warmth that some cats have, but a calm declaration of presence. I am here. You are not alone. This is sufficient. "Tomorrow," I said. I drank my tea. "Let's see what happens tomorrow." The courthouse in Millhaven was a building I'd walked past for 30 years. The way you walk past buildings in a town you've lived in long enough, present and unregistered, background to everything else. It was October, and the maple trees around the parking lot had gone their full spectacular gold, and the morning was cold with the specific cold of New England in autumn, the kind of cold that feels like clarification rather than punishment. Patricia Vance was already in the conference room when I arrived, her reading glasses on, her notepad out, the documentation arranged in a sequence that was, I thought, a satisfying thing to look at. Everything in order, everything cross-referenced, the whole paper architecture of my life laid out with the precision it deserved. Gerald arrived with his attorney, a tall man named Prescott, who I recognized from the Millhaven Bar Association directory, which I had looked up because I am who I am. Gerald was wearing his good suit. He looked, for the first time in months, slightly less certain than usual, which I noticed and filed away. The conference was mediated, not a full courtroom proceeding, but a formal, structured negotiation. And what happened in it, I will describe not in tactical detail, but in the essential truth of it. Gerald Ashworth had built his case on a foundation that looked solid and turned out to have a hole in it. He had counted on a version of history that the documents did not support. He had counted on a version of Nora Ashworth who would be grateful for whatever was offered, who would want to keep things quiet, who would not have spent 3 months in the county archives building a counter-narrative from primary sources. He had counted on the wrong woman. The mediation lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Prescott asked for a recess and took Gerald out of the room. They came back 20 minutes later. Gerald sat down. He didn't look at me. The new proposal was significantly different from the original. I will not tell you the exact numbers because money in these stories is always complicated and always somewhat beside the point. I will tell you that the settlement reflected, with considerably more accuracy than Gerald had originally intended, the reality of what we had built together, what I had contributed, what the 38 years were worth in the ledger that courts keep, which is imperfect and imprecise, but more honest than what Gerald had originally offered. I will tell you that when Patricia slid the revised terms across the table to me, I read them twice, and then I looked at Gerald across the table for a long moment. He was looking at the table. He looked, I thought, old. Not in a cruel way, just genuinely old. The way people look when something they were sure of has turned out to be wrong. "This is acceptable," I said to Patricia. She nodded. She signed. I signed. Gerald signed. At no point did I feel triumph. What I felt was something quieter and more durable, a kind of clean exhaustion. The feeling after very hard work has been completed. The thing had been accomplished. Now there was after. I should tell you about the moment in the parking lot. I was walking to my car. Patricia had already left. Gerald was still inside with Prescott. And I was thinking about what to do with the afternoon, specifically whether I wanted to stop at Ruth's flower shop or go straight home, when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Derek. He'd been inside, apparently. I hadn't known he was there. He looked like he'd been up late and hadn't slept much, and he looked like a young man who had been carrying something and was very tired of carrying it. "Mom," he said. I stopped. I turned around. "I wanted to see," he said, "how it went." "It went well," I said. He nodded. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. A maple leaf fell between us, one of the gold ones, very large, landing on the concrete with the papery whisper of autumn things. "I'm sorry," Derek said. He said it simply, without preamble or qualification, which is the only way apologies of this kind work. I looked at my son. I thought about 1.5 years of silence. I thought about what it would cost to hold that against him for the rest of our lives, and what it would cost not to. "I know," I said. "I should have—" "Yes," I said, "you should have. But you're here now." I paused. That counts for something. He looked at me with the face of a 22-year-old who is just beginning to understand that the adults in his life are actual people, which is a discovery everyone has to make eventually, and which is, I found, universally devastating when it arrives. Can we get coffee sometime?" he said. "Just talk." "Yes," I said. "Not today, but yes." He nodded. Another leaf fell. I turned and walked to my car. Mencken was in the back seat. I'd brought him along in his carrier against every reasonable instinct because Cassidy had a class and I hadn't wanted to leave him alone, and because I am apparently the kind of person who brings a cat to her divorce mediation. He was sitting upright in the carrier, eyes wide, looking around the parking lot with the alert, interested expression of an animal encountering a new environment. I got in the car. I sat for a moment. The maple trees were extraordinary in the October light, the specific, low, golden light of October mornings that turns everything a little unreal, a little more significant than usual. "Done," I said, to Mencken and to myself and to the empty car. He made a sound, not a meow exactly, more of a chirp, the small conversational noise cats make when they're acknowledging something. It seemed like the right response. I started the car and drove home. The first thing I did when I got back to the house was call Bev. She answered before the second ring. "Tell me." "Done," I said. "Settled." A long pause, and then Bev said, "Jesus Christ, Nora." And I could hear in her voice the same clean exhaustion I felt, the feeling of something concluded. Good terms? Good enough, I said. Better than he wanted. Good enough is better, she said, which was profoundly Bev. Are you okay? I think so, I said. I think I'm actually... I stopped. I tried again. Yes, I think I'm okay. I'm coming over, she said. You don't have to. I'm already putting my shoes on, she said, and hung up. She was across the street in 4 minutes. She came through the front door, I'd left it unlocked, and stood in the entryway and looked at me, and something passed between us that didn't need a name. All right, she said. What do you need? Honestly, I said, I need lunch. I've been up since 2 and I haven't eaten. That I can do, she said, and went to the kitchen. Ruth came over an hour later with flowers from the shop, a loose, fragrant bundle of late dahlias and something with silver leaves that she'd put together in the particular unhurried way she had, as if the act of arranging flowers was itself the gift. She set them on the kitchen table and sat down, and we ate lunch and talked about nothing important for a while. And the afternoon light came through the kitchen windows at the angle it only gets in October. And Fitzgerald slept on the counter. On the counter, again, still against the rules. I'd completely stopped enforcing it. And Mencken sat on the windowsill and watched the hydrangea bush with professional interest. We were 3 women in a kitchen in the middle of a weekday, eating sandwiches and talking about Ruth's supplier situation and Bev's niece who'd just gotten engaged, and the ceramic class Callie had proposed for the following month, a holiday ornament workshop, which Bev felt strongly was beneath her artistic ambitions and which Ruth thought sounded charming. It was, in its way, the best afternoon I'd had in years. 4 months later, in February, I moved. Not out of Millhaven. The settlement had structured things so that I could stay, and the house on Sycamore Terrace went to Gerald, which was fine because I hadn't wanted to stay there anyway. There's a difference between fighting for what's yours and wanting to keep it, and I had fought for the equity without particularly wanting the house, which I think confused Gerald, but was actually very clear in my own mind. What I wanted was a fair accounting. What I did with the result was mine to decide. I found an apartment, a good one, on the 3rd floor of a building on Hazel Street, with windows that got morning light and a small balcony and hardwood floors that didn't creak because they were new, which I found disorienting at first and then simply different. The building allowed pets. Fitzgerald and Mencken, who had by this point completed their foster period at the shelter, and whom I had, with the efficiency of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the formal acknowledgement, adopted, came with me. The move took 1 Saturday. Bev organized it with the logistical competence of someone who has overseen hospital transfers. Ruth brought lunch. Cassidy helped carry boxes. With Derek, they'd come together, which I noticed and thought was promising, the 2 of them working something out between themselves that I didn't have to manage. And by evening, the apartment was full of boxes and furniture and 2 cats who were conducting a thorough investigation of the new perimeter. Gerald moved Tiffany into Sycamore Terrace in March. The baby, a boy I heard through the particular information network of a small town, was born in April. I wished them nothing specific. I simply did not think about them very much. Ruth called me in April, 11 months after it all began, on a Thursday morning. She called at 9:30, which was reasonable, and she said, "I think you should come to the shop today." "Is something wrong?" "No," she said. "I just think you should come." I drove over after lunch. Mill Street was in that particular state of April, tentative, the first green things showing, the air smelling like possibility in the specific way that only April does. The rest of the year can't manage it. Ruth's shop was full of spring flowers, tulips, ranunculus, the first peonies. It smelled extraordinary. Ruth was at the counter, arranging a centerpiece. She looked up when I came in and said, without particular emphasis, Carol from the land records office called me. She wanted to know how you were. I was slightly surprised. Carol and I talked a few times, I said. I wouldn't have thought she'd... She said you were the most thorough researcher she'd helped in 20 years, Ruth said. She seemed to find it memorable. I laughed. It was a real laugh, the uncomplicated kind. She also said, Ruth continued with more care, that the county library district is looking for someone to consult on their archive digitization project. Apparently, they need someone who understands the organizational systems of pre-digital records. She looked at me. It's part-time, very part-time, but the project director is excellent, according to Carol. I stood in the flower shop in April and thought about this. I thought about the land records office and Carol's passionate opinions about filing systems and the particular satisfaction of finding a document in a box where it had been sitting for 27 years, waiting for someone to look. I'd have to think about it, I said. Of course, Ruth said. I thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. Yes, I said. I'd like to talk to them. Ruth went back to her centerpiece. She was smiling, slightly. She'd known I'd say yes. She'd known because she knew me, in the way that people who have been your friends for 15 years know you. Imperfectly, accurately, with love. It was May when Cassidy called me. She was at her dad's for the weekend. She'd started going, tentatively, which I thought was right. They needed their own accounting, she and Gerald, in whatever form that took. And she called me Sunday afternoon in the particular way of young people who call their mothers when they need to say something but aren't sure how to start. Mom, she said. Dad's... She stopped. Tiffany is... She stopped again. It's okay, I said. Take your time. It's just different there, she said finally. It's just not like before. Before. She meant before the divorce, before the baby, before everything. She meant the house on Sycamore Terrace when it was still a certain kind of place, when the dinners were made and the laundry was done and the invisible scaffolding was in place, and you could stand inside it without knowing that someone had built it. I know, I said. I don't want you to think I'm complaining, she said. I know I was, before. I know I didn't. Cass, I said, you were 19. You were learning. I should have told you. Yes, I said, you should have. A silence. Not a working silence this time, a softer one. Can I come over next weekend, she said, to your place? I want to see the cats. Of course, I said. Fitzgerald will be very pleased. She came on Saturday. We ate brunch. She'd offered to cook, and I let her, which was a thing I would not have done a year ago. I would have stepped in and taken over because it was easier and faster, and that is what I did. She made eggs and toast, and they were slightly overcooked and perfectly fine. And we sat at the small table in the apartment with the morning light and the view of the street, and Mencken sitting between us like a black hole of judicial authority. And it was not repaired. That's not the right word. But it was something. It was the beginning of something that might eventually be called okay. And I thought that was enough. Derek came for coffee in June. We went to a place on Mill Street, not far from Ruth's shop. A small place with good coffee and a reasonable noise level, and the kind of chairs that suggest you're expected to stay for a while. We sat for 2 hours. He told me things about the year and a half, about what his father had said when he'd told him, about the particular kind of paralysis of knowing something and not knowing what to do with it, which I believe is real, which I believe was genuinely what happened, even if I also believe he should have done something else. I told him things, not everything, and not for sympathy, but because he was my son, and he was 22, and he needed to understand that the version of events his father had been operating from was not the complete one, and that completing the picture was something I could offer him, even if it was uncomfortable. At one point he said, "Did you love him, Dad, before?" I thought about the apartment on Whitfield Avenue, the novel he'd read to me when I was sick. The first years, the real years, before the gradual drift that I hadn't noticed until it had gone so far that noticing didn't help. "Yes," I said, "for a long time." Derek nodded. He looked at his coffee. He looked like a young man carrying something that he was beginning to understand he would carry for a while, and that carrying it was simply what you did. "I'm trying to figure out who to be," he said simply. "I know," I said. "So was I, about 3 months ago. It gets clearer." "How?" I thought about the county archives and Patricia Vance's office and Bev's kitchen at 8 in the morning with scrambled eggs and the specific satisfaction of a document found in a basement box. I thought about Fitzgerald sitting on my feet at 2 in the morning. "One thing at a time," I said. "You just do the next thing, and then the next one." He nodded. We ordered more coffee. We talked about his job, which he was thinking of leaving. He'd applied to a graduate program, something in environmental policy, which surprised me and shouldn't have. I'd spent enough time with him to know he was more thoughtful than his circumstances had required him to be. I told him that was a good instinct. He seemed slightly surprised that I thought so. We walked out into the June sunshine and stood on the sidewalk, and he hugged me. A real hug this time, less stiff, the hug of someone who has decided to try. And then he went to his car and I went to mine. I sat in the car for a moment. June in New England has a particular quality of abundance. Everything green, everything loud with birds, the light long and generous. A year ago, I had been standing at a kitchen sink washing a chipped coffee mug. I started the car. I should tell you about the ceramic ornament workshop in December. Callie had been right. It was charming. We made small, star-shaped ornaments and a set of bells that Bev executed with a precision that surprised everyone. And Ruth made a series of tiny wreaths that were genuinely beautiful. And I made, because I am apparently sentimental when I'm not paying attention, a small orange cat. It was a rough, small orange cat. The proportions were imprecise. The expression I'd attempted, Fitzgerald's expression of patient philosophical attention, came out looking more like mild digestive trouble. But it was, unmistakably, him. Bev looked at it for a long moment. "I love it," she said. "It's not very good," I said. "It's perfect," she said. "It looks just like him." I hung it on the small tree in the apartment that December. My first December in the new apartment. My first December as a technically single woman in 38 years. And Fitzgerald sat beneath the tree and looked up at his ceramic representation with the particular quality of stillness that might have been recognition, or might have been interest in the ornament as a potential prey item. It's genuinely difficult to tell. Mencken sat on top of the bookshelf and looked down at both of us with the expression of a creature above such concerns. The apartment smelled like pine and something baking. I'd made cookies, the kind my mother had made, the kind I'd made every December for 38 years, but this year was making because I wanted to, and not because the family expected them. An important distinction I'd found. I called Cassidy. She was at Gerald's for the first part of the holiday. She'd come to me for the second. That felt like a workable arrangement. Imperfect, like most workable arrangements, but honest. I called Derek. He was in Vermont, visiting a friend from his new program. He sounded lighter than he had in the spring. I told him about the ceramic ornament. He laughed. I sat by the window with Fitzgerald in my lap. He had graduated to lap sitting somewhere around October. which represented a significant emotional development for an animal who had presented himself initially as deeply private, and looked out at the street. December in Millhaven, the streetlights on at 4 in the afternoon, the particular quiet of snow falling without accumulating, just suggesting itself. I thought about the chipped coffee mug that I'd finally thrown out the day I moved. I'd found it in the cabinet, wrapped it in newspaper, and put it in the recycling. I'd held it for a moment before I did. It had been a good mug. It was time. I thought about what 38 years look like from the inside and from the outside and from the remove of 11 months, and how different those views are, and how all of them are true simultaneously, which is the complicated thing about time. I thought about the archive project that had turned into, by December, a genuinely absorbing part-time position, 20 hours a week, working with Carol and a rotating cast of college interns to digitize 40 years of county land records, which sounds dry and is, in fact, completely engrossing if you're the kind of person who finds the patterns in information as interesting as the information itself. I thought about Bev across the street with the excellent window boxes and the unfailing coffee and the 30-year supply of direct honesty that I had not always wanted and had always needed. I thought about Ruth's flower shop and the dahlias she'd brought on the day of the settlement, and how the flowers had been perfect and she'd known they would be, because Ruth always knew which thing was the right one. I thought, I am 63 years old, and I am sitting in an apartment I chose, in a city I know, with a cat who has decided to tolerate my company, and I have work that interests me, and friends who tell me the truth, and children who are, imperfectly, effortfully, learning. I thought, this is what after looks like. Not triumph, not the clean redemption of a story that knows exactly where it's going. Just this. The lamp on, the snow suggesting itself outside, the cat warm in my lap, the small orange ceramic cat on the tree, lopsided and specific, made by my own imprecise hands. Fitzgerald shifted, settled deeper into my lap, and exhaled, a long, satisfied cat exhale that seemed to contain, in its small, warm way, an opinion about the evening. I agreed with him. I poured myself a glass of wine, the decent red that Bev had introduced me to, which I'd bought 2 more bottles of because I had decided I was allowed to like good things. And I sat with it and the cat and the window and the snow, and I was, for the first time in a very long time, entirely present in my own life. The coffee mug was gone. The hydrangea I'd never pruned was Gerald's problem now. The house on Sycamore Terrace, with its creaking floors and its 30 years of invisible work, was behind me. What was ahead was not yet visible. That was, I had decided, exactly right. It was enough to be here. It was more than enough.